Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being at the first session of the fourth Ignite series that COTAD is offering. We are so glad to see so many here, and I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Stephanie Lancaster. I am an occupational therapist, and I am in Memphis, Tennessee tonight. I am the vice chair of COTAD and have several exciting panelists to introduce to you tonight and some information about COTAD and, of course, lots of information about how we can be better at inclusion in the OT profession of individuals with disabilities who want to or are working in the OT profession. So I want to give you a little bit of history about the Ignite series. This is a series that originated as the brainchild of the COTAD chair, Dr. Arame Anvarazade, whom you're going to hear from in just a minute. She at the time was the vice chair of COTAD, and several of us put our heads together and to think about what sort of action-oriented steps we could take as an organization and as individuals in the early days of the civil unrest, which really came to a head, as everyone knows, in our country after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. As a grassroots, action-oriented organization, COTAD swiftly responded by developing and organizing the Ignite series. We literally put the very first session together in just maybe a couple of weeks or maybe even a little bit less. It was fast and furious because we knew that action was needed. And we wanted to create a platform to elevate the voices and share the knowledge and experiences of Black and Indigenous people of color, or BIPOC, in the OT profession, as well as those with disabilities, people in the field of OT who identify as LGBTQIA+, and other underrepresented members of the OT community. Through Ignite series events, we're expanding our efforts to provide support, resources, safe spaces, and communities where people from all backgrounds can learn and come together to be enriched by colleagues whose experiences often go unheard. The overall goal of the Ignite series is to ignite people in the OT profession to take action to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice within the OT community. So our very first Ignite series consisted of 4 different sessions, all centered on the topic of addressing racism and its impact on occupation and OT. Shortly after that session ended, we launched our second Ignite series, which was 3 sessions, and that was around the topic of action and inclusion in OT education. Following that, last fall, we had the Ignite Series 3 with also 3 sessions, and that was based on the topic of addressing LGBTQIA+ inclusion in occupational therapy. And that brings us to where we are tonight, kicking off the 4th Ignite series, which is around the topic of call to action for disability inclusion in occupational therapy. So I'm going to let you know that after tonight's session, we have 2 more sessions in this series. The next one will be about recruitment, retention, and support of OT students with disabilities. And the 3rd session in this 4th series will be about promoting inclusion of people with disabilities in the OT profession. So you can see how that sequence looks. Now, a little insider information I'll give you is that shortly before this session, Sorry, I just realized the captions weren't on. I'm so sorry. Let me fix that. I'll fix that before our panelists start. Sorry about that. But that I lost my train of thought there. We are going to, shortly before this session ends, the registration for session 2 will open, and we'll tell you how to get to that. And then we'll open the registration for session 3 right before the end of session 2. We'll share that information at the end of tonight's event. I would be remiss if I did not thank our supporters and donors. We've had donations come in through people who are signing up for this event, even though it's a free event. People who are able are recognizing that this work, though we often make it open access, it's not free for us to do. We have expenses. And so we appreciate you contributing to our efforts, and to our donors who are supporting us through this series, the other series, and many, many other endeavors. But we're still in the very early. So before we move ahead and get to the next part of tonight, I want to make sure everybody is on the same page as far as the community agreement. We all need to use I statements and realize that where we are coming from, where we are situated tonight, is from our individual place, space, experience, and position. Recognize that everyone has their own truth. Allow space for others to express and finish their own thoughts. Talk about the problem, not the person. Respect everyone's experience and voice. And something you'll hear us say a number of times is we want to be action oriented. We hope that you end this session tonight with at least one thing that you're taking with you that you plan to do around DEI in OT, and specifically around increasing inclusion of OT students and practitioners with disabilities. So here's our agenda for tonight. We are shortly going to begin with the panelist presentations. Then we will launch into breakout sessions, and we have a couple of discussion prompts for you during those sessions. And then we will come back for a large group debriefing, and then just before 8, we'll have the closing. So now you know what to expect. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you my good friend and colleague and the COTAD chair and the AOTA incumbent vice president, Dr. Arame Anvarazade.
Thank you, Dr. Lancaster. Wow, I appreciate that, my friend. I am so excited about this series. We've been talking about this particular Ignite for months now, and it's been on top of mind, and we're so excited to see it come to fruition. So thank you all for being here, 242, wow, on a Thursday evening. So we are so excited to have all of you here. I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about COTAD's history very briefly. I could go into this for hours, but very briefly, and a little bit about our mission and vision and some of the things that kind of encompass COTAD. So COTAD really started from a group of emerging leaders that we were part of an AOTA the AOTA Emerging Leaders Program. Some of you might still be familiar with that. Dr. Hoyt, I see, is on here, who's also one of the founders. And we were very, very concerned about the Centennial Vision. And we got to go back now to what, 2012, 2013 at the time. I don't even know right now what year, but around that time. And so I just want to say that COTAD has been grounded and rooted in this work for almost a decade now, right? So it's not a reaction, a jerk reaction from June when DEI became the trend or the on-cool topic to really address, but we've been very focused and concerned about specifically diversity, equity, inclusion within our profession and how to decrease health inequities. And so we were very concerned about the Centennial Vision because, you know, you had the pieces of being evidence-based and science-driven, which we saw were coming into fruition, but we really wanted to address the part that really talked about diverse workforce that met society's occupational needs. And, you know, Dr. Amy Lamb, who was the AOTA president at the time, you challenged us. She said, well, why don't you do a presentation at the next conference? And we did. We definitely did. And we talked about why it was important to have a diverse student body, why that will contribute to a diverse workforce, and how that will decrease health inequities. That's always been our goal. And at that moment, COTAD was born. It came from very grassroots efforts, and people flocked to us with any and everything that had to do with diversity. And, you know, it's before equity and inclusion became the on-trend terms. Any and everything that came with diversity, we had to really address. And that's why we created COTAD. I think people think that this is our full-time, you know, jobs, but we were all a group of volunteer leaders from all over the country. We've been building COTAD remotely since 2012 via Zoom, and just been very passionate about, like Dr. Lancaster said, being action-oriented and executing. Our mission, next slide please, has always been about to empower the occupational therapy leaders to engage in practices that increase diversity, equity, and inclusion for a more transformative occupational therapy profession. And our vision is truly to have a future in which occupational therapy is accessible, which is really appropriate for tonight, inclusive and effective for all. And I want to say that COTAD is really at this point of our phase 2 of our organization. We're no longer truly, our heart is always grassroots, but we're officially a nonprofit. I do want to say that we have moved beyond just DEI. We are also about justice and anti-racism initiatives, which are different from just DEI. We are about creating action-oriented and tangible changes within our profession. So that I want to make that clear about where COTAD is and where we stand. Because we needed some kind of structure and organization, next slide, please. We organized our organization in pillars, right? And one of my favorite ones, I have my baby COTAD chapter right here. You have it first, Dr. Lancaster, so I'm going to go in on it. You know, I just finished welcoming Jacksonville University COTAD chapter literally 35 minutes ago. We are growing and growing, and 2.5 years ago had this idea that every OT and OTA program should have a safe space where students are becoming more culturally responsive practitioners. We're looking up now 2.5 years later, and we have over 90 official chapters across this country, and the students are doing work. They are mobilizing, they are empowered, they encouraged, and I just love the chapters. The chapters are just becoming a life of its own. So shout out to all the chapter chairs and chapter members who are on this call tonight. I know you all are here, and you are always representing. COTAD Ed was also an original pillar, and it's kind of like the chapters for academicians. And it's really where we want to support creating DEI within academia. And so right now, this decolonizing the classroom and anti-racist classroom, it's really cool now, but we've been about holding our accreditation standards accountable to increasing having DEI in it. We've been about having diverse faculty being represented. We've been about having lived experiences in different diverse case studies since the beginning of COTAD, and that's COTAD Ed to be a support for faculty to make sure that DEI is embedded within all curriculum. COTAD CMP, we actually voted on this a few weeks ago, so it's not updated in our logo. It's no longer MMP, that was our minority mentorship program. We do not believe in using deficit-based language, so our new name for this program is COTAD CMP, our COTAD Minority Program. We believe that, COTAD Mentorship Program. We believe that mentorship is key. We believe that everyone should have a mentor, and it was initially made for new grads, but we've been seeing an influx of current students and pre-OT students really flocking to this part of our organization, and we welcome everyone. And COTAD community, I'm so proud to say, is one of our newest pillars. And it shows that the impact that we have in chapters, the people leading COTAD community were original chapter chairs who are now colleagues who are involved in our national organization running COTAD community. And it's how do we share DEI initiatives within our community. I could go on and on and on about our pillars, but two new ones that are not even on our website is COTAD State. It's about increasing this conversation across all states, not just within AOTA one time a year, but having the conversation and visibility of COTAD and what the work, the mission and vision at all state conferences. And then COTAD Impact is about the impact that we're making within our profession. Now, we talk about evidence-based, science-driven, but there's a lack of diversity-driven data. And that is what we want to plug in. We want to make sure that there is diversity, equity, inclusion data that is funneled through our profession, that people can utilize publications, books, resource articles. And so COTAD wants to be a truly part of the impact in the evidence that's being funneled through our profession. So that's a little bit about our organization. We've always been rooted in advocacy. It's threaded throughout our organization. We were in the conversation when Vision 2025 was being developed, and we advocated for the pillar of inclusivity, which was not originally there. We were in the conversation of how entry-level OTD impacts diversity, and we were in the conversation advocating for legislation to increase allied health resources for people from diverse backgrounds. That is just a nutshell, tip of the iceberg of how COTAD is organized. We have numerous amazing leaders and now members who are part of this organization, which is all volunteer, that continues to make it a well-oiled machine. We thank you so much for being a part of COTAD, all of you members, everyone here, and we appreciate your support for what we believe in. So I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Lancaster, who has a wonderful program ahead with fantastic panelists. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anvarazade. So here's the title for tonight. We are going to talk about barriers and challenges of people with disabilities in the OT profession. But before I introduce the first of our wonderful panelists for tonight, I want to address something that's really important for us to acknowledge and consider. Because Ignite was originally created to elevate the voices in the BIPOC community, we attempted in planning for this series, and so tonight's event and the next two events, to find panelists who identify as being in the BIPOC community. However, with only 16% of OT practitioners and 26% of OT students who responded to the most recent AOTA workforce survey from data in 2019, with only that small percentage identifying as being from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group, there's an even more limited number of OT students and practitioners in the BIPOC community who have a disability. So I wanted to acknowledge that that was something that we have been trying to make happen. And we realize the importance in elevating the voices of people with that intersectionality. And we want to learn from people who have all sorts of different challenges and backgrounds so that we are as inclusive as we can be within COTAD and in the Ignite series. We have some wonderful panelists, and there are some who come from the identify as underrepresented groups. We are going to hear from a number of people from different backgrounds, and I just wanted to acknowledge that before we proceed. So our first panelist for tonight is Dr. Carrie Morgan. Dr. Morgan received a Master's of Science degree in Occupational Therapy from Washington University and a PhD in Movement Science, also from WashU. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and currently is an assistant professor for the program of Occupational Therapy and Neurology at Washington University School of Medicine. She's actively involved in conducting research and mentoring health professional students. The focus of her clinical and research career has been to generate empirical knowledge, helpful for guiding rehabilitation to improve the participation of persons with a mobility device once they've been discharged from rehabilitation and are living in the community. Dr. Morgan's work has ranged from community based studies to basic mechanistic studies focused on increasing physical activity, preventing secondary conditions, and improving overall health. In addition, she's deeply involved in the community, working with disability organizations to promote health and wellness for people with disabilities. Dr. Morgan is an avid wheelchair athlete. In 2009, she was the first woman to be selected to represent the U.S. national wheelchair rugby team. She's competed in 3 Paralympic Games on the U.S. track and field team that included Beijing in 2008, London in 2012, and Rio in 2016. She has won 4 Paralympic medals and 10 World Championship medals in distance ranging from 100 to 800 meters. So it is my privilege and pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Carrie Morgan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lancaster. Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I want to thank COTAD for hosting this series of sessions and bringing attention to this topic. I know there's a lot of emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion these days, and in our profession as well. And I think an important part of these conversations needs to also include being more inclusive for people with disabilities. I believe that people with disabilities have a lot to give to the profession of OT, but there's still many barriers and challenges in our profession to fully including people with disabilities as our colleagues. So the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to share my personal experience and highlight some of the barriers and challenges that I experienced through my journey from OT school to identifying a fit in the OT profession for myself. So let me start with a little bit about me. I've had a physical disability since the age of 1. The day after my first birthday, I contracted a virus called transverse spinal myelitis, which is basically inflammation on the spinal cord that was at the C6 level. Basically presents like a non-traumatic incomplete spinal cord injury. I have limited hand and trunk strength, and I use a manual wheelchair for everyday mobility. I grew up with a disability. I really don't know any different. It's really my normal. I grew up receiving lots of therapy. I had so much PT and OT that when I turned 14, I told my parents that I just couldn't take it anymore. And at that point, I just wanted to be a regular kid and not get pulled out of the classroom for therapy sessions anymore. So my parents found it pretty ironic when I decided that I wanted to become a therapist. During college, I was actually a business and psychology major, and junior year, I realized I liked it, but couldn't really vision a future in business for myself. At the time, I had a friend in OT school, and I was really intrigued by the experiences she was having. It was clear to me that I obviously greatly benefited from therapy in my life, and it was an important component to preparing and helping me to be successful in many areas of my life. And I started to get really excited about what I could give back through this profession. I had some initial concerns about the physical demands of being an occupational therapist, but through research and lots of conversations with others, I realized that there's so many different aspects of being an occupational therapist, some more physically demanding than others, and I was certain that there was a fit for me somewhere in the profession. To this point, I had really gone through my life really being the only person that I knew in my community that had a visual disability. And I had to constantly talk about my disability to others and advocate for myself, and thought, wow, this is going to be a profession where I won't have to do that. I won't have to explain myself because people will understand accommodations, they'll understand disability. And I think that was a little naive. I think I was partially right in thinking that and partially not. So I applied to many OT schools. I was a little worried about what OT schools were going to do about admitting me. So I was honest in my personal essay, and I talked about how I had a disability and how I thought that would give me insights and perspectives that would help make me a better professional. And I did get into several OT schools. The OT school that I attended was very accommodating. They did a nice job in really sort of following my lead, that if I needed assistance, I needed to reach out for accommodations. One area that I knew was going to be an issue in school was learning transfers in school. And so I was pretty proactive with working with my advisor, figuring out how this would be addressed. And so we came up with a plan that I would learn all aspects of how to transfer someone. I would do as much of it that I possibly could do on my own. And then I would be able to talk someone else through the rest of the steps of the transfer. So my advisor discussed this with the course instructors on how to grade this, and this was approved, and I did pass that portion of my schooling. And that's kind of how I went through OT school. I think, the one thing so I anticipated that as being a challenge. I think the one thing that I didn't anticipate going into OT school and going into OT as a profession is sort of the initial reactions of colleagues and fellow students. It was almost like when they first got to know me is that they wanted to be my therapist rather than my colleague, or rather than my friend, or rather than my peer. And that they were always kind of second guessing if I was going to need help. And they, rather than kind of asking me or having a discussion, they would jump in and just assume I was going to need help with things. And so this kind of took me a little while to get used to, and I could see it coming now and sort of address it earlier on. But really, I went through my life with learning how to accommodate. I didn't go to OT school to have other people tell me how to accommodate for myself. And so as people got to know me, I think they realized that they didn't need to do that anymore, but that was definitely a learning curve for me. Fieldwork was kind of the next challenge. I think on level ones, the thing that I realized was that when I was sitting there, clients would come in and they would think I was also a client or a patient. And so I would have to sort of figure out nicely how to say, no, I'm actually here as a professional. The level twos were a bit more challenging. The first spot that the fieldwork coordinator and I decided to try to place me, we decided to disclose my disability. And that actually didn't work out so well. They responded and said that they would not be able to accommodate me at their site. So for the next two sites, we decided not to disclose. And one I felt okay about because I knew the people there and they knew me. But the other one was a little risky because it wasn't a local site. It was in another state. So I was kind of going to another state, banking on that it was going to be okay. But it was an outpatient upper extremity rehab clinic that was affiliated with a hospital. And I got there the first day, and it was really obvious when the CI looked at me from her facial expression and her nonverbal communication that she was pretty surprised and shocked, I would say. She expressed concern that I was going to have some difficulty meeting the demands at that site. So I said, you know what, why don't we call the fieldwork coordinator and get her on the phone? And so my CI talked to the fieldwork coordinator. And I overheard the CI say to my fieldwork coordinator, this is not what I signed up for. And so that was pretty hard to hear, and my impressions kind of looking back was, I know more now that she was completely understaffed. She was really looking for a student to come in there and help her with her productivity levels. And her immediate view of me was that I was not going to be that person, that I was not going to be able to be a protective person at that site. So I give her credit because she listened to my fieldwork coordinator and she decided to give me a trial period, and it ended up working out okay. But that those 3 months that I was there, it was really on me every second of the day to prove myself. I felt like I needed to go above and beyond, which was just physically and mentally exhausting. So I successfully made it through fieldwork. I started to look for a job. I struggled a bit. I ended up taking a temporary job in the program of occupational therapy in the research division. I had done a research project as part of my master's degree, and my mentor needed some part-time help for 6 months. So I'm like, well, this is great. This will kind of buy me some time to find a job. And when I was there, our OT program also has a clinic, and they needed clinical help doing wheelchair evaluations and assistive technology evaluations and trainings. And so I worked for a while at the university doing part-time research and part-time clinical. And funny enough, my clinical experience with wheelchair seating and evals, I did have to deal with transfers, but was able to work it out with Typically, if somebody needed a transfer, they came with a family member and I was able to help sort of supervise it, or I had a technology provider there that was able to do the transfer, or colleagues were able to help out. So it always got addressed and it never became an issue. And then I was had the opportunity also to do some teaching. And so this was like a perfect thing to me as an OT to be able to do a little bit of research, a little bit of clinical work, and a little bit of teaching. And I definitely did not get into OT to do research. But the more clinical work I did, it became very evident that OT as a profession, we need better evidence. And so I got really motivated by that and went back to school for my PhD. And these days, that's what I'm doing full time, is as working as a faculty member, doing a little teaching, but mostly guiding my own research. So that's a bit about me. I think through my story, you probably heard some barriers and challenges I experienced. And I think if I had to categorize it, I think the barriers and challenges really come in different forms. I think the first one is really people's attitudes and their beliefs and their values. You know, I live this every day outside of the OT bubble, where people constantly think you can't do something or that you're broken and you need to be fixed. I didn't really expect to get it in the OT bubble. And that was pretty shocking to me when I experienced that, when people just they automatically came to this conclusion that my productivity was going to be lower, or that I was going to hurt myself, or just sort of these impressions that I didn't expect. I would say the sort of the next categories of barriers and challenges were really related to policy. And, you know, I think a good example of this is a close friend of mine has MS, and she works in an inpatient rehabilitation setting, and she's starting to have some issues with fatigue and overheating. And I've had many conversations with her about how to approach her supervisor for accommodations. And she went in and was very prepared, and she really was not received well. And they basically said, you know, we can't accommodate you. That's showing favoritism. If we give you a break earlier than we give everybody else, it's going to look that we favor you. And really what's going to happen here is that site's going to lose a really, really dedicated, passionate, skilled OT, because she's not going to be able to maintain that job unless they do start thinking about accommodations. And again, and a lot of their responses to her also went back to sort of this productivity conversation. And I think the third category is really sort of this physical barriers, right? So, you know, can we meet physical demands, but can things be made accessible? And a good example of this is before COVID, but I was invited to a NIH rehabilitation conference for researchers. And these are all health professionals, right? And it's NIH. And I'm pretty excited. I'm jazzed I got invited. And I do a pretty good job of really being proactive on making sure things are accessible when I travel. I made an oversight on this one. So I assumed, poor assumption, that the NIH shuttle that they were providing from the hotel to the NIH facility would be accessible. So I went down like everybody else and got in line for the van, and you know, somebody had to come up to me and say, you know, you can't get on this van, it's not accessible. And so, you know, there was a taxi behind the van. So, you know, I got in the taxi and you know, we followed the bus. The bus goes through security. Our taxi tries to go through security, but I didn't have clearance to get through security. So then there's all these phone calls. So then I'm an hour late to the meeting. I roll in, all the accessible seating's in the back row. So it wasn't really like I could be part of the conversations. So certainly, did I get to go to the conference? Yes, I did. Did I get to be in the room? Yes, I did. Was it at the level that I wanted to participate and felt like others had the opportunity to? It certainly was not. So, you know, I think some barriers are really big, not allowing people in OT school because they're viewed that they don't have the physical ability, or not being accepted by colleagues because you do things differently or you receive accommodations. But some barriers, you know, may not seem as big, but they kind of add up over time. You know, two small examples of this is in our faculty area, all of the office supplies are above the copier. Well, if I ever want a pen or a sticky note, I have to go find a friend to get office supplies down. So that gets a little old over time. And, you know, even just things of trying to feel included as a faculty member, something went out about a walking club that the OT program was going to start, and that we were going to track people's numbers of steps, which I'm a very active person. I would like to be in a club associated with doing physical activity, but I wasn't quite sure how I was going to sort of fit into that. So, you know, in summary here, we have a really great profession, and I definitely wouldn't do it any other way. I am passionate about being an OT, but we need to do better about inclusion. People with disabilities bring so much to the profession, and we're missing out. They bring so much to the people that we serve. And there should never, ever, ever be an opportunity where someone wants to be an OT, but it's turned away because we can't figure out our inclusion issues. That's kind of my story. I have one more slide that I just sort of wanted to show you. My three main occupations in my life are really being a professional, an OT, and a researcher, being a competitive athlete, and being a mom. And you know, I think having a disability made me a better OT and a better researcher. But I think being an OT actually made me a better athlete and a better mom. So I've learned so much through being an OT about how to accommodate and how to do things differently. So I'm happy to be here tonight. I'm thrilled to hear the other panelists, and I'm happy to be a resource or answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Next on our panel is Danielle Lancelette Watson, who is an OT practitioner specializing in hand therapy. Danielle grew up on Long Island, and after graduating from NYU with a degree in art history and philosophy, she lived and worked in New York City. She was extremely active, participating in activities like snowboarding, endurance cycling, and rock climbing, and often traveled to other places, including foreign countries, to engage in those things. In the summer of 2011, while rock climbing in Colorado, Danielle fell and sustained a spinal cord injury. She went through several surgeries and an extensive rehab process as a result, and later went back to school to earn a master's degree in OT at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, as an individual with paraplegia and a wheelchair user. Danielle now is involved with multiple adaptive sports organizations and enjoys many adaptive sports like mono skiing and both road and off-road hand cycling. She is a competitive hand cyclist and founding member of the first all-women's hand cycling team sponsored by the Challenged Athletes Foundation. She also pursues adventures in the outdoors, and in 2018, biked the 100-mile White Rim Trail in Canyonlands for the movie in production, Adapted the Film, which is about the importance of outdoors to those with disabilities. With a passion for advocating for disability justice, Danielle currently works as an OT in Lacey, Washington, and has obtained her certified hand therapist certification as of 2020. So welcome, Danielle. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I hope you all can forgive me. This is my first Zoom presentation. I've been, working in person as a hand therapist, so this is very new to me. And I'm really excited. I've been looking at the chat, and I'm really excited to see all the OT students and OTs with disabilities and advocates, allies that are supporting at this event. So thanks, everybody. So yes, about me, I am a T4, T6 paraplegic. I am complete, and I'm a wheelchair user, a manual wheelchair user. I saw someone on Instagram this week, like it's important for us with disabilities not to compare ourselves to other people with disabilities because everyone's so different. Our bodies are so different. So I'm sure everyone tuning in is going to have a different experience, and this is just our experience, right? So one thing I feel like I need to start with is that I did have an experience trying to get into physical therapy school before I applied to occupational therapy school. I love our profession and I'm so glad that I found it, but I did once think I wanted to be a physical therapist. I wanted to do that before I got injured. And then I got injured and went through rehab, and I decided I still wanted to be a physical therapist. So I applied to PT school twice, actually. Um, the first time I applied to two PT schools, and then I went on interviews at both, and I just didn't get in. I had a 4.0 average in my prerequisites. So then I decided, I reflected the next year. I decided this is what I really want to do. I really want to push boundaries, and I applied to 12 PT schools all over the country. And both times being really open in my essay about my disability. And second year, I went on many interviews, spending thousands of dollars to travel all over the country. And again, I just kept getting no, no, no. And some of them even openly said it was because of my disability. But thankfully, the University of Puget Sound called and they said that I wouldn't be able to complete the PT program because of the physical requirements, but they discussed with the OT program and they didn't see a problem with my disability, and would I be open it's really, really unconventional, but would I be open to switching my application from PT to OT for that very same cycle, which I'm so grateful for, because I really would have been so crushed if, again, I didn't get in after all that work. And so I just think that's a great story. At that point, I was really ready. I felt like for what I wanted to do, which was hand therapy anyway, it was, it was going to work out great. And then I was able to go through OT school and find out what a way cooler profession it is. No, I love it. I love the holistic nature of OT, and everything worked out perfectly. But that is my experience in finding OT. And I think it's really sad and strange that a profession that works so closely with people with disabilities would exclude people from disabilities from being in the profession. So I also, love OT so much more for being inclusive, ideally inclusive of people with disabilities. So once I got into OT school, there weren't a whole lot of barriers getting through the program, I would say. Similar to Carrie, the transfers was the most complicated part. And I did it in that during the practical exam, I had someone posing as a caregiver, and I had to explain to the caregiver how to do the transfer safely. So that's how I was able to do my exam. And then in anatomy lab, the program or the school got me a standing frame so that I could see the cadavers, which were high on the tables. And then then the barrier was the clinical rotations. So I also didn't expect how challenging that would be. I had a great opportunity, I thought, to do a field work in the rehab where I did my rehab for spinal cord injury. So I actually was going to be a student of my OT that I had when I was in rehab. But we started to email back and forth, And I just didn't get, it was through email, but I just didn't get the perception that she was really as excited about this opportunity as I was. She was just like, how are you going to do this? How are you going to lift people, move people? How are you going to do X, Y, Z? It was very blunt. And at that time, and the like little experience I had advocating for myself at that point, I just kind of shrunk and was like, I don't want to do this. And thankfully, a hand therapist jumped in, and I was able to do my field work too with a hand therapist, which was also my dream. So it worked out perfectly. But that, I felt like, was an opportunity to be a really beautiful experience, to go back to where I did my rehab and give back and be a therapist, and to work with people with a similar disability, which is something in the back of my mind, which I think would be really cool, but just the physical barriers are there. So that was the internship part. And then as I work in an outpatient physical therapy setting, I feel like I haven't had a whole lot of barriers to deal with. I have now worked with 3 companies, so I have some comparison now, and I could say thankfully that my company now is the best. And the slide is up of where I currently work. And so before I arrived, they asked me how I wanted to set up the splint pan, which is in the back left of the picture. And I told them the height of my knees, and I needed a table this height. And they actually, maybe they couldn't find one, but they got this really cool mechanical adjustable height table. And then on the right of the screen, they knocked out under the sink. So now I can just swing under there and use the sink, no problem. They installed an automatic door before I arrived, and they changed the bathroom to make it accessible. The employee bathroom, the patient bathroom, was accessible already. But what the biggest point that I wanted to make is not to make people with disabilities constantly advocate for every little thing for themselves. We are therapists. We do have a basic knowledge. We should have a basic knowledge of accessibility and the ADA. And if you know something, you could just do it. Like my work did this perfectly. I feel like they didn't ask me, do you want a automatic door? They just installed the automatic door, which they should have had in the first place. But that finally got done, and it's really cool because I get to see it help so many other people. Like this older man who comes in with a walker, they're like, hey, you can press the button now. So I know I could see that it just doesn't just benefit me. And like under the sink, they didn't ask me, do you want us to remove under the sink? They just did it. But then for the bathroom, they said, what would you like in the bathroom? What would make that best? What height would you like the splint pan at? And things like that. So it does get exhausting to constantly advocate for yourself. And I just appreciated how that was done at my current workplace. And the other thing I wanted to address was patient perception. So as an OT with a disability, that would be probably the biggest thing I deal with. And a lot like Carrie mentioned, it's them thinking that you're you're a patient, or their look at you like, well, I go to the waiting room to get them and they're like surprised. And like I once had this older woman say, you're in worse off shape than me. So especially with like older people, getting that buy-in of that I am a professional and that I am able to offer some assistance to them. And then another thing that could be difficult is I see like many patients per day and a lot of new people, and I am often asked about my accident and why I'm in a wheelchair, and it's just having to tell that story repeatedly. So that's a fine line, you know, because if people are curious or interested, I want them to be able to ask, but it's also for some people, that's a traumatic event for them. So we have to be sensitive about that. Maybe if you're an OT and you're wondering how, or an OT student and you're wondering how to approach a colleague about that, definitely don't let it be the first or second thing out of your mouth. But once you get to know the person, you could ask in a sensitive way, I would say. So I'm excited to do the breakouts and answer people's questions, but that's what I've got about being an OT student and a clinician. And the picture up right there is just what I've been doing in my free time. I'm not a medalist or Paralympian, but I have been really enjoying competing on my hand cycle and being with other women in that endeavor.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
You're welcome.
I'm pretty in awe of both of you guys for your athleticism. And I think it's always interesting to hear about people with disabilities and what leisure activities they turn to and how they find fulfillment in different ways. And maybe that's a way that's in an adaptive sports or something else. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to introduce our next panelist. So this is a privilege for me to introduce who I believe is maybe our first international panelist in the Ignite series, Dr. Susan Mahipal, who completed a PhD from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario in rehabilitation science in 2015 and a clinical master's in occupational therapy from the University of Toronto in 2004. She identifies as a disabled clinician and a critical disability scholar. Her doctoral work explored how her own reflections on living with spina bifida can be used to critique normative assumptions on disability within rehabilitation practices and society at large. Her research, teaching, and writing interests include advocating for equality, justice, and anti-oppressive practices within the rehabilitation sciences, academic ableism, how rehabilitation science programs exclude disabled students, and using narrative research in teaching critical disability studies concepts within rehabilitation and disability studies programs. Susan teaches as an instructor in the undergrad Disability Studies program at King's University College at Western University, Canada. She guest lectures extensively throughout many Canadian OT programs on critical disability studies and anti-oppressive clinical practice. She consults on several prominent research projects underpinned by disability studies and disability researching partnerships. Susan also has a professional practice where she consults with, advocates for, and supports disabled and chronically ill women in navigating their disability and health-related needs. She's married and lives in London, Ontario, with her husband and her retired racing greyhound. She grew up in Austria, Germany, and Canada, and is a skilled pianist and clarinetist. She participated in jiu-jitsu, wheelchair tennis, para rolling, and swimming until chronic pain and challenges with pacing led her to reimagine her work-life balance. Susan is an avid gardener who is known in her family and friend circles for propagating way too many plants, and she often pawns those off on anyone she can. So welcome, Susan. I'm going to turn the mic over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Lancaster. Hi, everyone. So, well, thank you very much. It's kind of hard going last because the first two, Carrie and Danielle, were really great in sharing their stories. And yeah, I'm talking to you today all the way from our very wintry and cold London, Ontario in Canada. It's really cold in my office, actually. And I admit that I have to admit I felt a bit insecure today about whether I should share my story, because this will be the first time that I will have shared my story openly to an OT audience. And so how do I choose what stories I tell you about? And so I've been a wheelchair user my whole life and an occupational therapist for 17 years, 19 if you count the student years. And as I planned for this talk, I realized I hardly know other OTs with disabilities. So I was excited to meet and speak with Carrie and Danielle about this topic tonight. So leading up to tonight's panel, I reflected on a couple of things. One of the first messages that we received as OT students when I was in school was this notion of the OT world is a small world, or at least in Canada. So I can't remember in what context it was brought up, but for me, it reflects this indoctrination into a culture, kind of this deep understanding that we stick together and we have each other's backs no matter what. But with this also comes this understanding that we don't critique our own. And I find this interesting because I have been critiqued as a disabled OT for my differences all the time, my deficits, and you've heard Carrie and Danielle talk about this as well. And I guess for not being able to quite conform to what our profession views as normal. So I have staunch OT allies, and I am grateful for that. But I also have experienced the greatest disableism in my life from the very people I work with. And disableism has taken me by surprise, and it has, I guess it's made me feel unwelcome and question whether I belong at times in the field. And a second reflection for me centers on how my non-disabled OT colleagues consider barriers within my life sort of as just within the physical environment. And many of my barriers to work life and healthcare, they are definitely physical, but there are barriers that are much more insidious. Like they take the shape of attitudes and perspectives about disability in the language we use, in the actions we take. And those barriers have been much harder for me to reconcile. They relate to systemic power, they relate to policies and structures that reinforce and normalize ableism. And I find that these barriers deeply impact the disabled and chronically ill students who wish to apply to our programs and become occupational therapists. But these barriers also significantly affect those of us who are disabled practicing occupational therapists. And again, I'm talking from Canada, so the experience might be different from the States. But I think from the stories I've heard, there's also some similarities. So today, I work as an OT and a critical disability studies scholar. So Dr. Lancaster already introduced my doctoral work. What's interesting about being a critical disability studies scholar is that the rehabilitation sciences in general are considered non-disability studies spaces. So my work is all about critiquing and exploring all perspectives, multiple perspectives, and on how we understand disability and how power is shaped and enacted in the lives of disabled and chronically ill people. And I intentionally identify as a disabled woman and a disabled clinician because I forefront a socio-political understanding, because I understand disability as constructed by society. And I resist the narrative that my disability is a problem that needs to be fixed, cured, or to be overcome. I'm privileged in many ways too. I am white, I'm middle-aged, I'm married, I have a supportive family. My husband has a stable income and benefits when I do not. We live in a wheelchair accessible smart home that we designed and built ourselves. I represent a small sliver of the disability community, which is a very heterogeneous group. And if you're interested in reading more about my work, I have cited some of my publications on the next slide. So where do I start today then? So as a disabled child born with spina bifida, I was raised in a society that totally rewarded me for overcoming my disability. And this overcoming narrative had never failed me. I started my undergraduate studies in 1996, and I applied for the OT program in 2001. And as an undergrad student, this concept of student accessibility services, it was just non-existent. Like, I think they were just being implemented at Canadian universities. So most buildings were inaccessible. I recall that in the first 2 years, I think, of my undergraduate studies, there was one accessible wheelchair washroom on the entire campus. And it was also a time when computers took up an entire desk, and faculty members, one faculty member allowed me to use her office computer because I couldn't do my statistics homework because the computer lab was inaccessible. So obviously these are different times. We don't have those issues so much anymore today. But I learned that when I asked for help or I pointed out inaccessibility, that sometimes people perceive me as incompetent and ungrateful and unable to survive in this world. And I definitely took that into the OT, that sort of attitude into the OT program with me. And when I got accepted into the University of Toronto to study OT, that was definitely the greatest highlight of my life. But I was the only visibly disabled student in my class, in the entire OT program and in the whole Faculty of Medicine. And one thing that I hadn't anticipated, I was sort of confident that I was going to get through the physical barriers and sort of figure out how to accommodate myself. But I didn't expect the OT program to challenge my lived understanding of disability. And Carrie and Danielle have also talked about that, as you're kind of seen as a client, or you're seen as a patient, or people all of a sudden want to figure out how to treat you and what your problems might be. So I learned about how non-disabled people think about and study people like me, and that was pretty hard. And then by the end of the first year, the OT program had taken a huge physical and mental toll on me. With us in Canada, the programs are full-time. I participated full-time, even though I knew I would never work full-time. And when you have many specialists and physiotherapy appointments and daily physio exercises and medication schedules and a neurogenic bowel and bladder, you need flexibility for appointments and self-care, essential self-care tasks. And I managed to do all of those without impacting my studies. But I think the faculty and my peers, they had no idea what went into my making it through every day. And by the time I finished my first year of studies, I was developing really worrisome physical changes. I had recurrent bladder infections, one serious kidney infection, and living with severe intractable chronic pain that finally got diagnosed to a permanent tethered spinal cord. And I had pressure sores because I was sitting so much, and I also lost quite a bit of weight. So the program pushed me to my limits. And during our breaks, when my peers were taking vacation and enjoying time off, I fit all of my specialist appointments in and underwent procedures to help me survive the second full-time year of the program. I had to get a power wheelchair with dynamic tilt in my second year to manage my chronic pain. So on one end, my specialists berated me. They literally berated me for attempting graduate school. And then on the other end, the OT faculty often used me as an example in class and asking me to share personal experiences that my peers might find helpful to their education. Some profs realized that this was absolutely inappropriate. but many didn't. And I don't think the faculty ever put together that it was the program itself that was causing me to deteriorate, not the fact that I was living with spina bifida. So I had accommodations, and I did, with all of that, you can talk about the barriers, but I did have strong faculty advocates. So it wasn't all horrific and bad, right? But there seemed little room for me to problem solve solutions to my participation. The end goal was to get all students to pass that huge licensing exam at the end of the program, and to show that I guess people like me could cut it in that real world. We hear that a lot. You have to be able to manage in the real world. But those of us who live with disabilities and disabling chronic illnesses, we know that learning how to advocate for change within this real world is vital for us. And it's not about us learning how to change ourselves or how to bend ourselves towards this normality. So I understood early on that the more normal I was and the more normal I could pretend to be, that the more I was perceived to be capable and to be human. So a common phrase, I think the most common phrase I heard as an OT student was, I don't know if you can do this placement in a wheelchair. Yet each of my placements was a success for me, and I built excellent rapport with my supervisors, except for my final placement. Coincidentally, my final fieldwork placement was the first accommodated placement for me. And I was allowed to complete it part-time before we were scheduled to write the licensing exam. And from the beginning, my supervisor, she bullied me. I was put on the spot in front of peers and my supervisor's colleagues. She would ask me daily whether I was capable of comprehending my role, to conduct like challenging assessments and write report summaries in really short time frames. And I was often asked to find research that most of my peers told me privately seemed unfair. I was also never explicitly told that I was failing this placement. The program then called me up one day and expressed disappointment because I didn't contact them about it, but I had no idea I was being failed. I really had no idea. The bullying and lack of support caused me to consider dropping out of the program, but then with the love of my parents, I literally only had 4 weeks left. I battled my way through, and then the final placement evaluation was probably the most hurtful thing I've ever experienced. And it was just dripping with ableism. I was told not to apply for OT positions and instead to shadow OTs in different roles over the next couple of years to find some appropriate practice fit in my supervisor's mind. In hindsight, I think she was trying to discourage me from working so that I wouldn't have enough clinical hours to keep my license current, I think. My supervisor's messages were clear. You don't know your limitations. You need to consider your obligations to safe practice. You are not competent. And last and most hurtful, maybe you want to let go of this idea of being an OT and find another career. So, this placement made me fear my disability for the first time in my life, and it completely shattered my confidence. I wrote cover letter after passing the licensing exam for OT positions, and I never received responses. So I started an experiment. I scrubbed my resume and cover letters for any mention of my disability or my disability rights work. And then I began to get calls for interviews. And then when the HR representative would connect with me, then I would ask, I use a wheelchair, is the interview location accessible? And at interviews, I sensed that the interviewers liked me and that I performed really well during the interview, but I never heard back about job offers. So then I learned to say, I know that you can see that I have a disability. I'm willing to discuss it with you should you want to talk about it. And then interestingly, because I know we don't have to disclose, but that's never worked for me. no one would bring disability up after that fact. And it took away some of that awkwardness during the interview, but it also feels really precarious and vulnerable to open oneself up in this way every time and not sure as to what's going to happen with that conversation. So eventually I was hired in schoolhouse support, and that was a great fit for me. Lots of flexibility. The office environment definitely had to be changed for me, but my manager was very supportive, and that made a huge difference. We knew we had to find accessible schools, and that was actually quite a challenge. I ended up in the beginning having to drive across all of Toronto because the newer schools were on the outskirts of Toronto and they would be more accessible. And my catchment area was absolutely huge, and my colleagues recognized that I drove through an entire city with a population of 6 million people, and even though some of them might have an accessible school, they never transferred their schools to me. So it took about 3 years for me to be assigned fully accessible schools. And I also had to figure out how to function within the head office. So I also couldn't use the photocopiers, and the OT assessment cabinets were way out of reach for me. And they had created a more wheelchair accessible working space for me. But of course, all of my colleagues preferred my more spacious room over their smaller ones. So eventually my manager planned with me to book like one afternoon every week for me to come in, and then the admin staff would reserve or like protect my accessible spaces for me. And this schedule created a bit of a challenge with the short time limits assigned to picking up and dropping off charts, because I think you're supposed to do it within 36 hours or something like that. But again, my manager advocated for me, and that was then not an issue with the referring agencies. And then after I established myself in schoolhouse support, I also was able to cover some maternity leaves within rehabilitation centers, where I also received appropriate accommodations. But that was after I had several years of working as an OT under my belt. I've stopped going to OT conferences because I've been stranded at airports when my colleagues just hop into a cab. I have been isolated from social events because there's no wheelchair accessible transportation, kind of like what Carrie was talking about. Airlines have made a fuss because of the battery in my smart drive that helps me propel my wheelchair up ramps and carpeted surfaces. Broken wheelchairs, missing wheelchair parts, inaccessible hotel rooms within group pricing, meaning that I often have to pay full price. I have been patted on my head in elevators by colleagues who are happy to see me and unable to present in rooms with inaccessible, really huge podiums. I feel so excluded sometimes that I'd rather stay home. And I've mentioned this to organizers, and some do want to talk to me about it. But if I'm the only wheelchair using OT who attends these conferences, I wonder whether there really is any point for them to try to include me. Just recently, one of the organizers said she wanted to talk to me about it, so I'll see how that goes. So sometimes the barriers that I experience seem so small to me, like they don't really matter. And I think that is because I've normalized a lot of these experiences for myself, and it's my internalized ableism. And sometimes barriers represent a feeling, not just a physical obstacle. For example, a few weeks ago, I participated in a meeting with a diverse group of academics and OTs. And going through the minutes from our last meeting, I noticed that everybody had their credentials next to their names, except for me. Next to my name, it read disability expert. And even the PhD students got to have PhD student or candidate next to their names. So I sent a private message to the organizer asking her to please write in future Susan Michael, PhD, OT, critical disability studies scholar. I said that it was important for me that people know my qualifications to contribute to this committee. And this is a committee on equity and social justice within occupational therapy. I'm not just a disability expert. I'm a scholar with equal ranking to, if not even higher, to people on this committee. Yet a large barrier for me is that I will always remain or represent a client, a tokenistic contributor, not a colleague. I'm also not institutionally affiliated because I cannot work full time because of my chronic pain. And at times I have been told that I have gotten to where I am because I fill a quota, not because of my hard earned qualifications. The notion of me as a disability expert also brings this connotation for me of giving back. This means that I often do not get paid for the work that I do. So one final barrier for me represents comments by my colleagues that I technically, and I know Carrie and Danielle also talked about this, should not have been graduated as an OT because I can't perform a physical lift and transfer. Occupational therapy prides itself for its commitment to disability advocacy. We call ourselves disability experts, but are we? We spend a lot of time focusing on how normal bodies perform tasks. That is one thing we need to change. There is as much to be said about sound clinical reasoning, critical reflexivity, client-centered practice, and professional skills, all of which disabled and chronically ill students have much to contribute to. And we need to focus on recognizing that our future and increasingly diverse students need to be taught how to advocate for change within our fields, not to simply be asked to overcome their conditions and impairments so that they can survive in the real world as normal OTs. I know Dr. Lancaster talked about in the beginning about taking intersectionality seriously. I agree with this. This is really important. It's not just ableism that occupational therapy has to tackle, but we also have to recognize that disability will affect every one of us at some point in our lives, and it crosses all of the isms, all of the marginalized groups. And if we can't embrace this within our own ranks and support our students, our next generation, then we can't have a more inclusive profession for us and our clients. So I have so much more to say. This is sort of a bit of what I was thinking about today. And if you can also email me, or I look forward to the group discussions to talk about it more. And thanks for listening to my story today.
Thank you so very much. That was awesome. I could listen to you for the rest of the night and tomorrow too. And I bet the other attendees could as well. You all contributed so much to what we're trying to learn and the actions we're trying to take. So thank you very much. So we're going to move into the breakout rooms. I do want to say that I think this link is not working right now, so don't worry about that. What I want to ask you guys to do, though, is to, when we put you in breakout rooms in just a minute, I will send in a link in the announcements and get you guys to click on that, and that'll take you to a Google Doc, and you will be able to then input things that are coming from your discussion. So kind of the main points. I also will message in these prompts. So the three things I would like for you all to talk about in your breakout sessions: what stands out to you from the panel discussion? So, what's a takeaway you've gotten? What have you seen and or experienced that relates to inclusion of prospective or current OT students and OT practitioners? And what needs to change to improve inclusivity of OT students and practitioners with disabilities in our profession? So just off the top of your head, what your thoughts are now about what needs to change. So I am going to put you guys in the breakouts. You'll see that invitation coming now. And I'll send you a message when it's time to reconvene. I guess the link might be working. Some people are already getting there, but I'll announce.
I see Ignite 4.2 just launched.
Yes, I set that to launch during this. I thought that was kind of a encouragement for people to stay. All right, well, let's see where we are. Yep, we're good on numbers. Welcome back, everybody. We are going to continue on with this session with a large group debriefing. And so I know that some people were having trouble with the Google Doc, and I apologize for that. It'll remain open if you would like to enter something now or at a later time. And or we can share in this debriefing. I wonder if anybody might want to share from one of the prompts, just something that came to your mind from the panelists. Feel free to put it in the chat or unmute and speak if you would like.
Something that I feel passionate about is the link between colonialism and ableism. A way that it commonly comes up is in conversations about productivity. And like, if we identify as occupational therapists, if that's a key part of who we are, that we help people, and then we hear that we're hurting people in all these fundamental ways that we didn't know, that brings up this huge series of walls of defenses, where that challenges somebody's core identity, and they don't want to hear it, and they want you out of there. If you're only extending empathy to your clients and you're not extending empathy to other practitioners, I don't think that's real empathy. I think it's pity, and I think it's a superiority complex. It's a way for your ego to expand, and you're limiting your clients. You are limiting your clients in not believing that they can achieve everything. It will inevitably come out in your actions if that's the belief that you have. It's huge. It's societal. It's inherently intersexual. It has a lot to do with colonialism. Get excited about researching it. It's really cool. You guys are going to be awesome and feel more free when you learn more about it.
Thank you so much. That's really profound. That's something I think we could all spend some time thinking about. And there's the added issue of productivity, but I think we could even push that back and look at, in OT school expectations and, our thoughts about accommodations and things like that too. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to share about that? Or you are welcome to share about your experience or observations about the inclusion issues that we've been talking about.
I was very shocked by the schools not being able to accommodate, especially because OT is a field that's literally all we do is do accommodations, try to make things accessible. So that was very disheartening for me to hear. And we're a field that's moving towards community-based and non-traditional settings. So for the advisors and student faculty members that are fieldwork coordinators, how can you not find accessible and accommodating fieldwork sites is just beyond me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Amanda. It always makes me think about that song, Isn't It Ironic? When I think about, it's like a dentist with cavities, an OT that doesn't know how to be inclusive. It just doesn't make sense. Anybody else want to share?
Yeah, I'd like to share. I'm Ryan. I just think when talking about disabilities and specifically schools, because I'm a student, I think a lot of faculties expect you to prove in some ways how you're disabled. And a lot of that comes from having a doctor's note. Like I'm chronically, and luckily I have a very good relationship with my PCP and my hematologist and rheumatologist. So they'll always write me notes when I need it. But I think by always expecting students to supply medical notes like on demand, is really tied to like ableism and to like other things like classism and racism. And I think faculties, should be a little more considerate of like what it means to always ask students for medical notes, because the medical system is not built for everyone. And sometimes it can be really challenging to get those doctor's notes or medical notes. So I just wanted to bring that up.
That's a really, really good point. There's issues of copays and accessibility and things like that. And even just the simple fact of most OT schools don't really allow a lot of absences for people to go to doctor appointments and things, but yet then, we're requiring those notes. So anybody else want to share?
Yes, it extremely bothered me to know that, I'm trying to camera that someone would pat another human being in an elevator. I was discussing in my breakout group that I don't even pat younger kids on the head and say good job, or a baby when they do roll over. You don't do that. And so I just thought that was kind of normal human knowledge that you don't do that. Or maybe you weren't raised right. I don't know. Maybe your mama didn't teach you better, but my mama did. And so it was extremely shocking to me to just hear some of the ways that people were treated just because they looked different, or were in a wheelchair, or whatever it may be. So it irked me big time. So, and I'm going to try to be better about being more aware of being inclusive. And I thought I already was a pretty inclusive person, but I have a lot of work to do, and just being more aware of places and things that need to be notified that they're not accessible, and just learning how to do that. Granted, it's my second month in OT school, but there's always room for improvement. So
Thank you, Tatum. It's never too early to get ignited about that. And to me, that's really the stories that we hear and the things that make us sad and angry. That's what ignites us, and that's what can bring about change, even from allies as well. Erica?
Hi, I just wanted to share, as somebody with an invisible disability, different topics that I didn't quite hear brought up. For example, I don't do well without brain breaks during the day. I had a head injury a long time ago, and some of the fieldwork 1 and 2 experiences I've had, either they aren't willing to give you a lunch, or lunch is really a working lunch, or it's in a room where other therapists are working and it's really loud, and there's like nowhere to get away to take an actual break. So I've run into some other issues like that I didn't hear mentioned, and I just want to represent, I guess, and bring it up to put those on the table.
I'm really glad you did. And it's important for us to think about individual disabilities. We'll talk about this more in the upcoming sessions, but it really, it's easy to assume somebody's wrongly parking in a handicapped space, or, something like that, if we don't see the obvious need, but that's something we have to confront within ourselves. Sorry, Erica, did you want to say something else?
I'd be happy to say one other thing.
Yeah.
That happens with invisible disabilities. People assume if there's nothing visible, then everybody's just the same. I was not open with my classmates in OT school. I'm actually still in school. I'm in fieldwork, but during classes, I was not open with them. And there were many times I heard like, well, nobody in here deals with anything like this, but, and just kind of assuming that everybody has normal or average abilities. I find that really prevalent.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Candace, did you want to share?
Yeah, hi, Candace. just was so blown away by the speakers and what I'm hearing also from the rest of the sharers. And I think I'm a fieldwork coordinator and I work on a faculty, and I think that just what can be really, what I've experienced and what can be difficult for some students is even asking for accommodations or utilizing those accommodations, wanting to disclose that they do have accommodations. I think there does need to be a change in the narrative and a change in curriculum, or the change in the narrative in OT culture in general, in regards to especially, well, if you can't do X, you can't be an OT. I think that a lot of that work can be done. It's small and slow work, but I feel like my role in particular is to start making a change in how fieldwork educators think. And so that's what I commit to all to work towards doing. And then as the rest of us also become OTs, and we can also go forward with advocating for that change in our own curriculums. I found that when students have a voice and students speak up, people can tend to listen. And even though that change might not be immediate, knowing that your voice is a valuable impetus for change. I also think this conversation just brings to light the need for advocacy and for us to get involved as advocates at a political level, because it's ridiculous that in regards to accessibility and accommodations, I know sites can give you reasonable accommodations and also deny you if their accommodations aren't reasonable. But let's start changing the definition of like what it means to be reasonable. And let's start doing that work to making those structures different. And so I encourage all of you also to get involved with advocacy.
Thank you, Candace. Yes, it starts within ourselves, and one small change is a good place to start. Erin, did you want to speak up?
Me, Erin?
Erin Buckingham, sorry.
Hi, sorry, it's confusing because there's so many people with the same name.
Yeah.
But as a student with developmental coordination disorder, I can relate to the feelings of the panelists in kind of hoping that the OT world would be different and kind of understanding and kind of being disillusioned with that kind of aspect of the program. Something else I was gonna say. Oh, right. In our group, we talked about kind of how the experience of transfers being kind of shot down because of the transfers, and how that's just one aspect of OT. There's so much more to OT than just doing transfers, and by letting somebody go because of transfers, you're letting go an empathetic, person that has something to add to the program and has something to add to the field. That may be unique to that person and that they may be missing out on.
Thank you so much. Very good point. Kayla?
I just want to make this very quick, just for anyone that wasn't reading the chat. I'm curious if there's any work, any efforts related to making an inclusion a standard for accreditation with ACOTAD, because thinking about how in academia money talks and there's no data, no decisions, and all that kind of stuff, and thinking about how accreditation on the line would be quite a motivator for a lot of programs to get moving instead of waiting for a student with disabilities to self-advocate.
Yes, I believe that a number of us are taking notes on that point. So thank you for saying that. Erica, did you want to say something else? I see your hand still raised.
No, I just need to lower it.
Okay, no, it's easy to forget on there, and I'm never sure if people are still trying to like, what? One more thing. Okay, anybody else want to share? We have 3 or 4 more minutes.
I'll go if nobody else wants to.
Yes.
Okay. I guess the one thing that I've noticed, which this kind of already been brought up before, but just the lack of knowledge about disability, just by like CIs and other like fieldwork people in general. Like for example, I'm blind, so I went to my fieldwork and they knew a lot about low vision. And they were like, yeah, you can just read large print. And I'm like, no, I can't. Like that doesn't work for me. So just like more advocacy and more like basic knowledge about various types of disabilities. because, you know, even like in a lot of the textbooks and stuff, through school and stuff, it was all low vision, but no actual total blindness. But, you know, this is just my perspective, obviously, but, you know, just there's so much lack of basics currently. So,
Yeah, even just knowledge about different disabilities and how to accommodate for that. And I think, you know, I actually think all three of the panelists tonight talked about, you know, having to not only advocate for themselves, but to educate others. And it is something that hopefully will improve. Thank you all so much for sharing about that. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so I'm going to make a couple closing remarks. And I don't want to forget to mention this. It might be of interest to a number of you all. We have a very hot off the press initiative, something that has come to fruition after years of hard work and teeing this up within COTAD. But we just announced the COTAD New Practitioner Impact and Action Award. So this is people who are eligible are entry-level OT practitioners, so 3 years or less experience in the field. And this person must be invested in professional leadership and action to impact diversity, equity, and inclusion. The award amount is $750, and the deadline to apply is March 15th. The details for that are on the COTAD website. And I want to encourage you also to follow COTAD on social media if you don't already. We often announce things first there about new events or information and resources and other things that are going on. So I want to make sure that you all are noting that. Just wanted to share a couple of quotes also that relate to our topic. And I also don't want to forget here's our social media. All of this is also on our website, which is cotad.org. And I don't want to forget to also mention some resources that are out there that you and some others were put in the chat, and I'll add those to this slide for our next Ignite session. So anything you want to add, or if you just want to throw it on the Google Doc, I'll see that too. We do have a Book Plus Club, and it's called a Book Plus Club because it's not just books. Sometimes it's podcasts or other things. In fact, the next one is based on a podcast that is out there readily available, and that will be a week from tonight on Thursday evening. The registration is free and it is still open until 24 hours before the start of the event. If you go to the COTAD website, you will see that. And last but not least, the registration as of just a few minutes ago for our next COTAD Ignite 4 series session is now open. So that will be 2 weeks from tonight. So we've got the Book Club Plus Club next Thursday night, and then I'll see hopefully all of you guys back here for a continuation of this discussion in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for being here. A special thank you to our outstanding panelists. We really appreciate your time and sharing, and I appreciate the courage of everyone who spoke up here. Thank you so much.